The Middle Ages were an era of stark contrasts, where the grandeur of towering castles and majestic cathedrals stood in sharp opposition to the squalor of everyday life. Beneath the impressive stone structures, the streets told a different story, one of filth, decay, and unbearable stench. Cobblestone pathways, meant to guide merchants, travelers, and peasants through the bustling towns, also served as the city's drainage system. With no proper sewers, waste both human and animal was discarded onto the streets, left to fester in the open air. Rain carried the filth through the narrow alleys, forming thick, putrid streams that collected in the town's low points, turning them into cesspools of disease. The smell of rot was inescapable, settling into the very fabric of daily existence. Homes, shops, and marketplaces bore the oppressive weight of the foul air, seeping through wooden doors and shuttered windows. But the people, accustomed to the overwhelming odor, carried on without question. Vendors sold produce just steps away from piles of rotting garbage, and children played in streets where animal carcasses lay bloated and swarmed with flies. Even the grandest halls of nobility were not exempt. Though they were adorned with lit by flickering candlelight, the stench of unwashed bodies and soiled rushes clung to every corner, making luxury a relative concept. Efforts to manage the overwhelming filth were rudimentary at best. Town criers sometimes warned citizens against dumping waste too close to certain buildings, but enforcement was nearly non-existent. In larger cities, some streets had open gutters running through the middle, intended to carry refuse away, but in reality, they simply redirected the putrid mess. Night soil men, tasked with collecting human waste from chamber pots, worked under the cover of darkness, hauling away buckets of excrement to be dumped in rivers or fields. Yet, these attempts at cleanliness did little to stem the overwhelming tide of filth, and disease remained rampant. For those who lived in medieval towns, the stench of the streets was an unshakable part of life. The mingling odors of spoiled food, unwashed bodies, animal dung, and stagnant water clung to the air, coating everything and everyone in its grip. The wealthy masked it with fragrant herbs and perfumes, while the poor simply endured. And as the seasons changed, the smell only evolved. Summer heat made the streets reek with intensified rot, while the damp cold of winter turned the filth into thick, frozen sludge. In a world where sanitation was an afterthought, survival meant adapting to the ever-present stench of decay. Cleanliness in the Middle Ages was a fleeting concept, often dictated by superstition, poverty, and practicality rather than any real understanding of hygiene. Bathing, though available in some parts of society, was far from a common practice. Many believed that immersing oneself in water left the body vulnerable to illness, as it was thought to open the pores to dangerous miasmas, the foul, disease-ridden air believed to cause sickness. As a result, entire households could go months, even years, without a proper wash. Instead of bathing, people relied on dry methods of cleaning, such as wiping their skin with cloths, rubbing scented oils on their bodies, or simply layering on more clothing to mask the filth. But nothing could truly hide the ever-growing stench that clung to both rich and poor alike. Lice and fleas were an unavoidable reality, infesting the thick, matted hair of nobles and peasants with equal cruelty. Without regular washing or the means to rid themselves of these parasites, people endured constant itching and sores, which often became infected. Some tried to shave their heads and wear wigs, hoping to keep the pests at bay, but the wigs themselves became breeding grounds for vermin. Women, whose long hair was considered a mark of beauty, often coated their locks in powders or tied them up beneath headdresses, unknowingly trapping dirt and insects close to their scalps. These conditions were not just unpleasant, they were deadly, as fleas were the primary carriers of diseases that could sweep through entire communities with horrifying speed. Clothing, too, bore the weight of neglect. Most people owned only a handful of garments, wearing the same pieces for weeks or months without washing. The stiffened fabric, soaked with sweat, dirt, and bodily oils, became a breeding ground for bacteria. Underclothes, when worn at all, were meant to absorb the worst of the filth, but frequent laundering was rare, as soap was expensive and water sources were limited. The wealthy, and willing to suffer the same filth as the commoners, drenched themselves in perfumes and scented herbs in an effort to mask their own body odor. Entire rooms were filled with sweet-smelling flowers and incense, yet nothing could truly erase the foulness that clung to every person, every fabric, and every breath of air. For those who still sought the luxury of bathing, the experience was often far from refreshing. Public bathhouses, while offering a chance to cleanse, were communal and rarely sanitary. A single tub of water would be shared among multiple bathers, growing progressively darker with each new entrant. By the time the last person stepped in, the water was thick with sweat, dirt, and whatever else had been washed from the bodies before them. These bathhouses also became hotspots for disease, as illnesses passed easily from one unwashed body to another. Over time, as plagues and epidemics ravaged the land, even the few who had embraced bathing began to avoid it, retreating further into a world where filth was not just tolerated, it was expected. For most people in the Middle Ages, food was not about pleasure, it was about survival. Fresh ingredients were a luxury few could afford, and preserving food was a challenge in an era without refrigeration. Meat, when available, rarely arrived on the table in a wholesome state. By the time it reached the kitchen, it was often spoiled, its rancid stench masked with an excessive amount of spices. The wealthier one was, the more spices they could afford, leading to lavishly seasoned dishes that hid the unmistakable taste of decay. Those who could not afford such luxuries simply ate whatever was available, ignoring the putrid smell and trusting that a strong stomach would see them through. Bread, a staple of every meal, came with its own horrors. Infested with maggots and crawling with weevils, it was not uncommon for diners to simply pick out the larger pests and continue eating. If mold overtook the loaf, it was scraped off with a knife, and whatever remained was deemed safe enough to consume. Grain shortages led to desperate measures, with sawdust and ground-up bones sometimes mixed into flour to stretch supplies. Porridge and gruel, common among peasants, frequently contained insects, but hunger left little room for disgust. People ate what they had, no matter how unappetizing or unsanitary it might be. Drinking water was even riskier than eating spoiled food. Contaminated with human and animal waste, it carried diseases that could wipe out entire communities. As a result, ale and weak beer became the standard beverage for all ages, including children. The alcohol content was low, just enough to kill off some bacteria, but it was far safer than drinking from a river or well. Even milk, if not consumed quickly, would spoil, leaving few alternatives. Monasteries and larger households brewed their own beer, ensuring a steady supply of liquid that, while not entirely clean, was at least safer than the alternative. Dining itself was an unsanitary affair, with little thought given to hygiene. Plates were often nothing more than slabs of stale bread, known as trenchers, which absorbed grease and juices from the meal. Once too soaked to hold their shape, they were tossed to the dogs or the poor. Utensils were scarce, and most people ate with their hands, which were rarely washed before digging into communal dishes. Dirt and filth from unclean fingers mixed with the food, but no one questioned it. It was simply the way things were, another grim reality in a world where survival took precedence over cleanliness. Medical knowledge in the Middle Ages was a grim blend of superstition, religious doctrine, and rudimentary science. Few trained doctors existed, and even those with some formal education relied more on tradition than true medical understanding. Illness was often attributed to imbalanced humors, blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, leading to treatments that did more harm than good. Bloodletting, done by slicing veins or using leeches, was a common practice, weakening already ailing bodies. Cupping, in which heated glass cups were placed on the skin to draw out bad blood, left painful blisters that often became infected. Those who could not afford a physician turned to local healers, who relied on herbal remedies, prayers, and charms to drive out sickness. Hygiene was virtually non-existent, allowing infections to thrive. Teeth rotted away from a lifetime of neglect, with decay and abscesses leading to agonizing pain. Tooth extractions, performed without anesthetic, were brutal, often resulting in broken jaws or fatal infections. Wounds festered due to the lack of sterilization, and minor injuries could lead to deadly cases of sepsis. Skin diseases ran rampant, with boils and sores left untreated, spreading rapidly from person to person. The filth of daily life only worsened the situation, as rats and fleas carried unseen threats that would soon change the course of history. Among the most feared afflictions was the Black Death, a merciless plague that swept through Europe, leaving death in its wake. The disease struck without warning, its victims suffering from high fevers, blackened swellings, and agonizing pain before succumbing within days. With no cure in sight, terror consumed entire villages. Corpses piled up in the streets, overwhelming grave diggers and forcing the creation of mass burial pits. The air, thick with the stench of decay, carried the scent of death far and wide. Families abandoned their loved ones, and towns were left desolate as survivors fled, and knowingly spreading the plague further. Medicine provided no answers, and fear bred desperate measures. Some resorted to flagellation, whipping themselves in public displays of penance, believing that suffering would cleanse them of sin and spare them from the plague. Others blamed the sick, the poor, or even outsiders, leading to violent purges of those deemed responsible. Superstitions flourished, with bizarre cures ranging from inhaling crushed emeralds to bathing in vinegar, but nothing stopped the devastation. The Black Death wiped out millions, reshaping the world in its wake, leaving behind a society forever scarred by its horrors. Death loomed over every aspect of medieval life, an unwelcome yet familiar presence. The sheer frequency of fatalities, whether from disease, famine, or war, made death an accepted reality rather than a feared anomaly. In cities overwhelmed by illness, bodies often lay where they fell, left to rot in the streets until someone bothered to remove them. The church, burdened with more corpses than it could properly bury, resorted to stacking bodies in shallow, overcrowded graves. As decomposition set in, the sickly sweet stench of death permeated the air, clinging to the clothing and skin of those who remained. Burial was rarely a dignified affair. The wealthy could afford proper ceremonies, with elaborate coffins and marked graves, but for the poor, death was a quick and unsentimental process. Commoners were often buried in mass graves, their bodies tossed carelessly into pits that were hastily covered with dirt. Heavy rains would sometimes unearth these graves, exposing skeletal remains and rotting flesh, which were either left where they lay or shoved back into the earth with indifference. Churchyards became overcrowded, their soft soil unable to contain the sheer volume of the dead. Bones from older graves surfaced regularly, a grim reminder that the dead never truly rested. The Black Death only intensified the horror. With entire families perishing within days, there was little time for mourning. In the worst-hit cities, carts rolled through the streets, their drivers calling for people to bring out their dead. Bodies, many still warm, were piled high and dumped into plague pits, mass graves so vast they stretched for miles. Some victims, too weak to resist, were mistakenly buried alive, their muffled screams unheard beneath the weight of the newly dead. Fear of contagion kept the living from lingering. Priests hurried through last rites from a distance, if they dared to perform them at all. Yet, in the midst of this unspeakable decay, life persisted. Markets bustled just beyond the graves, their vendors accustomed to the scent of rotting flesh. Children played in churchyards littered with exposed bones, and bothered by the ghosts of the past. Death had become just another aspect of daily life, a silent companion to the living. As the world moved forward, the horrors of medieval death and burial practices faded into history, but the remnants of those dark times, plague pits, charnel houses, and forgotten graves remained, hidden beneath modern cities, waiting to tell their gruesome tales once more. Thanks for tuning into the past. Don't forget to subscribe and join me for more stories that shaped our world.